Hi guys, welcome to the first of a series of videos that is specifically developed to help you guys with drawing diagrams. Today we will start by looking at price fluctuations, how to draw these diagrams and when we need to use these diagrams. Okay, let's begin. Okay, prices of goods fluctuate more when its demand and or supply is more price inelastic. So how do we show this using a diagram? Let's look at a situation when we're trying to prove that prices of goods fluctuate more when its demand is more price inelastic. So we'll first start by drawing a relatively steeper and a relatively gentler demand curve. So this is how I will draw it. Notice that in this case, the reason why I'm able to say that the steeper demand curve represents a more price inelastic demand curve is because I'm comparing it with another demand curve on the same graph. Okay, next I will draw a supply curve that cuts through these two demand curves at the same point. Why would I want to do this? Because this will allow me to establish a common start point that allows me to do some comparison. Okay, so this is my original equilibrium point at the original price P and the original equilibrium quantity Q. So when I want to show that prices fluctuate more, first of all, I need to realize that for prices to have changed, the supply of this good must have changed. So for example, supply might have increased. If supply has increased, diagrammatically, that means that supply must have shifted rightwards as such. So in this case, supply has increased from SS to SS prime, and we can see that for the more price inelastic demand curve, prices fell to Pi, whereas quantity increased to Qi. If I compare the increase in quantity to the fall in price, you can see that the increase in quantity is actually less than proportionate to this fall in price. But when I compare the change in price with the more price elastic demand curve, you notice that prices have fallen only to PE and quantity has increased more than proportionately to QE. So therefore, we can conclude that when the supply of a good increases, prices fall by a greater extent. When the demand for this good is price inelastic, as you can see from the blue DDI line, as compared to when the demand for this good is price elastic, as you can see from the pink line. Okay, actually the same thing occurs even when we consider a fall in supply instead. So previously we considered the situation where supply increased. Now let's look at what happens when supply has decreased instead. When there's a fall in supply, there should be a leftward shift of your supply curve. So your supply curve shift leftwards like that to the purple color SS prime line. So you notice that for the more price inelastic demand curve, prices increased more to Pi as compared to the fall in quantity. And for the more price elastic demand, you notice that there's a much smaller increase in prices to PE, and there's a more than proportionate fall to QE for quantity. So again, you can see that when supply of a good decreases, prices increase by a greater extent when the demand for a good is price inelastic as compared to when the demand for a good is price elastic. So far we have managed to show that prices fluctuate more when the demand for a good is price inelastic as compared to when it's price elastic, no matter whether we're talking about an increase in supply or a decrease in supply. So it's the same situation. Is it the same situation when supply of a good is price inelastic as compared to when the supply is price elastic? You will see that the same situation occurs. So first, we will draw a relatively steeper versus a relatively gentler supply curve like this. So again, you notice that the reason why I'm able to claim that the steeper line represents a more price inelastic supply is because I am drawing it in comparison with another supply curve on the same diagram. Then I will draw a demand curve that cuts through these both lines at the same point. Again, I'm doing this so that there is a common start point for comparison. And yes, this is my original equilibrium price and quantity. So for prices to have changed, in this case, demand must have changed. So for example, demand might have increased and shifted to the right to dd prime. So you notice that for the more price inelastic supply curve, prices actually increased more to pi, and there's a lesser than proportionate increase in quantity to qi. But for the more price elastic supply curve, there's a much smaller increase in prices to PE and a more than proportionate increase in quantity to QE. So in this case, you notice that prices increase more when the supply of a good is priced inelastic. Okay, and the same situation occurs when we consider a fall in demand instead. So remember that when there's a fall in demand, your demand curve should shift leftwards. And in this case, you notice that prices fell more when supply of this good is priced inelastic. And as compared to the situation where supply of this good is priced elastic, prices actually fell lesser to PE instead. So again, we are able to conclude that when the demand for a good decreases, prices decrease by a greater extent when the supply of this good is priced inelastic, as compared to when the supply of this good is priced elastic. Okay, so when do we use these diagrams in what situations? So usually we use these diagrams when you want to explain observations where prices of a particular good, such as agricultural products like wheat, actually it may not even be limited to agricultural products only. We can even think of situations like crude oil prices. When you want to explain why prices of crude oil or agricultural products like wheat, why they have increased or decreased sharply. So you should be able to relate this explanation to what we have seen just now, that first of all, either the demand or supply of wheat or crude oil must have changed, and second of all, the demand and supply of crude oil or wheat must have been priced inelastic. Alright, that's all for this edition. I'll see you in the next video.